guys, it's Shara from Woodshop Diaries, and today I'm going to bring you part 3 of the matching mid-century modern furniture series. Now, if you've been following along, you know that I've been building bedroom furniture for this series, and I actually already built a dresser and 2 matching nightstands. But because I love building dressers, I decided to build a second one, this time one with doors. I've partnered with my friends at Cricut to add this modern design to the doors to give it even more of a mid-century vibe. Later in this video, I'll show you how I use my Cricut Joy machine to cut a template that's larger than it's technically capable of cutting to add this design. In the next video, I'll be wrapping up this series with the bed, so if you want to check that out, be sure to subscribe and follow along so you don't miss it. But for now, if you're ready to get building, let's go. If you want all of the specifics, I've got the complete plans for this build with dimensions and details linked in the description below. Now, I mentioned in my last video that I normally prefer using birch plywood for my projects, but my store was out when I picked up the wood for the nightstands, so I went with maple instead. Since this is a matching set and the nightstands were maple, I decided to stick with maple for this dresser build as well. I used 2 full sheets of 3/4 inch plywood to complete this build, plus 2 2x4s and some scrap poplar to cut the legs from, and also some 1/4 inch plywood to use for the drawer bottoms and the back panels. I started by cutting down my plywood sheets. I used my circular saw and Cricut grip cut to cut down 2 18-inch wide strips of plywood. For more information on cutting down plywood sheets, I will link a helpful video below. Once these strips were ripped, I brought them over to the miter saw to cut to length. Now, you could cut these to length using a circular saw instead, but I just used the miter saw because I thought it was a little quicker. I cut as far as I could one way, then flipped the sheet over and finished the cut. From these 2 strips, I cut a top and a bottom, plus 2 sides for the dresser cabinet. Now, just like the last dresser and the nightstands, I wanted the inside of the dresser to be 1 inch inset from the front edge of the main cabinet. This is purely for design, and I just like the extra dimension that it added. So I ripped 2 strips from the second plywood sheet to 17 inches wide and used these to cut the 2 divider panels. I set the rest of these strips to the side to use later. Once I had the top and bottom, the sides, and the divider panels cut down, I applied iron-on edge banding to the edges that will be exposed in the finished project. Edge banding is always optional, but I just think that it looks a little bit cleaner, so I like to use it. I'll link a guide to applying it in the description below if you'd like to know more about it. Once they were edge banded, I began drilling the pocket holes to assemble the main cabinet. Now, obviously you can assemble this cabinet with whatever joinery method that you prefer, but I'm using pocket holes in this case. In the process of preparing the pieces for assembly, I actually changed my original design, and instead of having 3 drawers in the middle section of this dresser, I decided to have 2 drawers and an open shelf at the top. I was planning on the middle dividers of the dresser, keeping my pocket holes on the drawer side, because with the drawers in place, you'll never see the pocket holes. However, since I'm going to leave that top section in the middle open, you'll see those pocket holes if I face them towards that way. So I'm gonna put the bottom of the divider pocket holes on the drawer side and the top pocket holes on the cabinet side. Normally, I'd put all the pocket holes on the same side of the board, but in this case, we're gonna go opposite. So just wanted to clarify that, why I'm doing it the way that I'm doing it. Once the pocket holes were drilled, I assembled the dresser cabinet using wood glue and pocket hole screws. I made sure to keep the dividers inset from the front edge 1 inch and the middle section centered. I used some scrap blocks to help me install the open shelf between the dividers. And after the main cabinet was together, it was time to add some design details. If you remember on the nightstands, I made an entire box inside of a box to get the 1 inch inset look. However, since this is much larger, it would be a significant amount of extra plywood to build an entire box inside here. So to fake it, I added some thin scrap strips where I could get away with it, and then just added a solid bottom panel in the cabinet sections because it did make sense to keep those smooth all the way across. I simply glued these pieces in place, keeping them inset from the front edge 1 inch, and used pocket holes and screws to install a drawer divider piece to evenly space out this drawer section. Now, I debated on how I wanted to stencil the design on the doors and if I wanted to continue that design onto the drawers as well. So I cut my doors to size first. Again, all the dimensions for this project can be found in the plans linked below. and I added the design to these doors first to see how things looked. So I did a practice door to make sure that this was gonna work out okay. It turned out really good. I'm really happy with it. The only thing is that there was a little bit of bleed through on the lines. I'm going to try to sand the second door a little bit finer grit, so hopefully the surface is a little bit smoother to hopefully help with that bleed through. Now, I did this with a Cricut Joy machine and some vinyl. Typically, the Cricut Joy machine is for cutting small things and not really for big stuff. But if you're creative enough, you can get away with making big things on a small machine. So let me show you how you can do this with a Cricut Joy. This is Cricut Design Space. So this is where you design your templates and your stencils or whatever you want to cut out on your machine. They've got templates that you can pick from here. You can also add text here, shapes. You can design this however you want. But if you drew something or you have an image from somewhere else that you want to upload, which is what I did, you can go to this upload, choose your image, and then here's where you can erase. So I can erase these background, and then I can erase all of the gray area I want to erase. And then there's my image. And I want to cut this image and insert it into my design space. So you can size this to fit your door, whatever size that you need. Now, once you get this to the size that you want, obviously you can't cut it out in one piece on the Cricut Joy because it will only cut out 4.5 inch wide sections at a time. So what you do is you click Shapes, make a square, and then you go up here and you size this square to 4.49 inches high, and then however wide you want it to be, like, so we'll say 20 inches. So now I can take this square and set it over my shape and then select both of these and go down here to where it says slice. Now it will slice this section off and I don't need these. And then repeat, and you can line all of these pieces up as you need them. So I've got mine right here. Now I can make it. And because I'm doing 2 of these, one for the top and one for the bottom, I want to print out 2 copies. So project copies 2, and I'm going to be cutting out vinyl. I loaded my Cricut Smart Vinyl into my Cricut Joy machine and let it cut everything out. Once it was finished cutting, I used some scissors to cut my sections apart. So I should have 6 total pieces, 3 for the top U shape and 3 for the bottom. I removed all of the parts from the stencils that I planned to stain, then used some transfer tape to allow me to transfer this vinyl to the door. Before applying anything, I sanded the door with 400 grit sandpaper to get a smooth surface to start with, and then I laid out my shapes and tried to figure out the best way to space everything out. I wanted my U shapes to overlap in the center of the door, so I marked where to start and began applying my stencil. I simply removed the backer off the vinyl and carefully stuck this in place. I found it easiest to do the 2 middle pieces first, then work my way down. This design is pretty forgiving, so if the lines get a little off on the pieces, I just use this little picker tool to lift the edge and reposition it. I'll link the tools that I used here in the description below. Once the stencil was in place, I used a utility knife to cut away a few of the pieces that I didn't want to keep. Then I ran my fingers along everything just to make sure that it was stuck down nice and flat to prevent any more bleed through, and then I used painter's tape to create an even outline along the sides. So I'm gonna try to stain this by just barely putting any stain on the rag and just like carefully wiping up and not side to side. I let the stain dry a few minutes, then removed the stencil and the tape. There was still a little bleed through, but I sanded the surface with 400 grit sandpaper again and it helped blend everything in. Clearly, I was excited about this result.
I love that.
After seeing how the doors looked, I decided to keep the drawers plain and moved on to building them. I set the doors aside for now as I was waiting on the hinges to come in the mail. If you've seen many of my past videos, you know that I build a lot of drawers, so you probably know the drill. I installed 2 pair of 16-inch ball bearing door slides into the cabinet, keeping them flush to the front edge of the dividers so that I can install overlay drawer fronts later. From the remaining 3/4 inch plywood, I cut down pieces for the 2 drawer boxes and cut dados in them to insert the 1/4 inch plywood bottoms. I edge banded these pieces and assembled using pocket holes and screws. Then I installed them into the cabinet. I know that was fast, but if you need more details on how to measure for, build, and install drawer boxes, I will link a drawer building guide below, and I've got all of the details in the plans linked below as well. Once the drawers were in, I used a Cricut shelf pin jig to drill shelf pin holes into the cabinet sections to install adjustable shelves later. Then I removed the drawer boxes from the slides to reduce the weight and move this dresser box off to the floor to build the base. Now, I have used this leg design several times before, so this probably looks familiar. I traced the template out on a scrap piece of poplar and cut out one leg. Once it was sanded down to shape, I traced it out and cut 3 more just like it. Now, you could cut these from scrap plywood, 1x material, or even 2x material if you wanted them thicker. I just had some poplar handy, so I used that for this. I set these aside for now and built the base frame using 2x4s. So 2x4s typically come with rounded edges, and to make the joints a little cleaner here, I trimmed these rounded edges off of the 2x4s before assembling them. This isn't necessary, it just makes it look a little bit cleaner. I used simple pocket holes and screws to assemble this frame slightly smaller than the overall size of the dresser bottom. Once this frame was assembled, I grabbed those legs and installed them on each corner. I used wood glue and screws to install each leg at each corner and used a square to help me position them at a 45-degree angle. I found it easiest to pre-drill a hole into the leg, apply some glue, then drive the screw through the pre-drilled hole. Once it was secured in place, I added a second screw for some extra hold. Then I flipped the dresser upside down and glued and screwed this base onto the bottom side of the dresser. Once we got it back right side up, I reinstalled the drawers, cut the drawer fronts, and installed those onto the drawer boxes. Now, I will note here that these drawer fronts, much like the drawer fronts on the other dresser, don't follow the quote-unquote typical spacing rules. As a design element, I left a larger reveal along the edges to show off the quote-unquote fake inset box. Now, normally I would want to cover all but about 1/8 of an inch of the edge, but in this case I used some 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch plywood to help me with the spacing on the drawer fronts. I was still waiting on the hinges for the doors in order to install them, so I went ahead and just applied a few coats of clear poly to the dresser and drawers. Once that was dry, I used my Cricut concealed hinge jig to drill cup holes to install the hinges. I left the back of the dresser open until this point to make installing the doors a little bit easier. These doors are inset, but since they are 3/4 inches thick and the inset is actually a full inch, I figured it might be easier to install them by setting them in place and crawling in the back side to screw the hinges in. With the doors in place, the last thing to do was staple the back panels in place and add the shelves. I opted to leave this top middle section open on this dresser to match the open shelf on the nightstands, so I only added a back panel over the cabinet sections. Then I installed shelf pins and added the shelves into each side cabinet. I'm seriously so happy with how this turned out. The last mid-century modern dresser I made was for a friend, but I'm not sure I'm going to give this one up. I love how the design on the door pulls in a more mid-century vibe and the cabinets provide plenty of storage. You can use this as a dresser, a console table in a dining room, or even as a TV stand. If you've enjoyed this build, be sure to head to the link in the description to grab the plans, and if you can't wait to see the next build in the series, be sure to hit that subscribe button to follow along. Thanks so much for watching, friends, and until next time, happy building!